Hello, MBAP 518 online summer students. This is Dr. Jaros with a video explanation for how I graded your first exam. So, if you are wondering how the exam was graded, why it says -5 next to this question or -3 next to that question, then please make reference to this video. This explains the answers that I was looking for. And so to the extent that your answer deviates from these answers, then there very well could have been a points deduction. So let's get right to the exam. And let's see here. Trying to set this up so I can look at the questions. Okay, question number 1. When a company decides to enter a foreign market, is it usually at an advantage or disadvantage compared to local competitors? Explain. What conditions should be present in order to make such a decision viable? Explain. Well, the first part of the question is that it is typically disadvantageous. Okay, it's at a disadvantage. The foreign company is at a disadvantage compared to local competition. Local competitors who have been established for a while naturally have greater knowledge of the market conditions and the cultural conditions and the political conditions that are on the ground in that country. As a newcomer, the foreign business typically has very limited knowledge of any of those things. And that's why this has been described by researchers as the liability of newness, right? Second part of the question about conditions that should be present, right? First, there are 3 conditions. First, the country that we are thinking about going into must have some distinctive attractiveness to motivate us to come. That is, we must think that there's something special about the market or the culture or what have you that lead us to believe that if we enter that market, if we establish ourselves there, that we can establish a profitable long-term business there, all right? Second, we have to have some distinctive competency, some special skill or ability or asset or resources that we believe will allow us to overcome that liability of newness and defeat the local competition anyway, right? That could be a product that we think is particularly attractive, some new technology that local competitors don't have, etc. But we have to have something, right? And third and very importantly, right? We have to believe that we have the internal assets and resources that allow us to better leverage our internal operations to exploit this opportunity compared with distant approaches to conducting business, such as licensing or exporting. Because when we decide that we want to do business in another country, okay, there are different ways that we can go about doing it, licensing and exporting being 2 of them. In order for us to actually enter that market with a physical presence, we need to believe that that is a better way, a more profitable way for us to conduct business there than things like licensing or exporting. Okay, let's look at question number 2. If a global company is facing a market in which pressures for local responsiveness and innovations are low, but pressures for integration are high, what kind of industry is it operating in? What kind of strategy should it pursue? Explain and describe. Okay. Well, the kind of industry it is operating in is what was described by researchers as a global industry. A global industry is an industry in which, pressures to be locally responsive and innovation are low, okay? But pressures for integration and efficiency and centralization are high. So the firm should use a global strategy. A global strategy basically means that, look, our prime directive is to keep costs down because that's how profits are earned in this industry. Firms in global industries compete on a cost basis, right? And that means keeping costs low, all kinds of costs, marketing costs, distribution costs, administrative costs, and in particular, economies of scale. And achieving economies of scale means centralizing our operations. We want to concentrate core activities such as marketing and production, in particular factories and research and development, in our home country, and then use a model that basically involves exporting the products that we make from our home country to other countries throughout the world. So that's what we're looking to emphasize when it comes to implementing a global strategy. Okay, now let's look at question number 3. If a company is thinking about expanding to a foreign country and does not take into account the different ways the countries can be distant from each other, what mistake might it make? Give an example from the article we read on this. All right. If it doesn't take distance into account, right? Remember the article we talked about by Gemawat, that you read, okay, talks about 4 different kinds of distance that can be important, right? Geographic distance, which of course is how far the countries are apart physically, right? Geographically. For example, Cuba is much closer to the USA geographically than is Spain, right? But then there's also cultural distance, administrative distance, and economic distance. 2 countries can be very close together geographically, but distant in other ways. Cuba is a good example. Cuba is very close to the US geographically, but culturally, administratively, and economically, it's far, far distant from us than, say, a country like England is, which geographically is across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? Basically, if you ignore those kinds of distance, you could end up choosing the wrong country to invest in. You might choose a country that is not fertile, is not a fertile ground for growing profits and developing a viable business. Okay? What was the key aspect of the article that drove this point home? Okay? CPA analysis, country portfolio analysis. In the article, Gemawat describes the use of country portfolio analysis, which is a commonly used tool that businesses use to evaluate a foreign country in terms of its prospects as a place to do business. And he shows how that for an American fast food company, if you use the CPA, okay, and do not adjust for these different types of distance, you will see the result of the CPA will be that Japan is typically the best place for you to invest in terms of developing your fast food business. However, if you adjust for those distance factors, then Canada becomes a much more viable and profitable place to invest, much more so than Japan. So this illustrates how if you don't adjust for distance, then you very well could make this kind of mistake. All right, last but not least, let's look at question number 4. What kind of strategy and structure has United Cereal historically employed in Europe? Has this helped or hurt its competitiveness there? Explain. Well, the answer is historically United Cereal has used a multinational strategy and structure. Okay? Why do we know this? Well, because as described in the readings that I had that were assigned, a multinational strategy and structure, a multinational strategy is one whereby headquarters is relatively weak, while the subsidiaries, the foreign subsidiaries that a company has, are autonomous and have a lot of discretion in terms of making decisions about how to run their operations. In other words, if our headquarters is in the USA, but we have a subsidiary in England, rather than that subsidiary in England being run by directives and commands from headquarters in the USA, headquarters takes a hands-off approach. And the manager who runs the British operation is basically free to develop their own business strategy and structure, okay, in terms of running their subsidiary. And you do this when the nature of the market is such that it is very fragmented, that different markets, different countries have very different market conditions and demand conditions, such that a one-size-fits-all strategy dictated by corporate headquarters wouldn't work. Okay? Has this helped or hurt its competitiveness? Well, initially, it helped their competitiveness, okay? Because the multinational strategy allowed, because the European breakfast market has historically been very fragmented. People in different countries in Europe wanted different things at a breakfast. And the MN strategy, the multinational strategy, has allowed UC to be very responsive to consumers in different European countries, okay? But recently it has become a liability, okay? And it's become a liability because European integration has created more of a single market Europe. In other words, European consumers their tastes and preferences in breakfast are converging and becoming more similar to each other. And so now you have a situation where with all these independent subsidiaries, you're incurring a lot of higher costs due to the proliferation of a lot of different types of products, proliferation of a lot of marketing, and duplication of effort in terms of product offerings and cost structure. This has also hindered the development of pan-European brands because local subsidiaries resist ideas from headquarters. And the juices, the proposed juices that the company headquarters tried to roll out, and the healthy berry cereal that it's trying to develop, that type of pushback from local subsidiaries, those are examples of that. Because that's what United Cereal needs to do. It needs to move towards a more transnational approach where it is developing Europe-wide brands, because this will allow it to meet those converging tastes and dramatically reduce its costs, which are higher than its competitors like General Mills and Kellogg's. All right, I hope my explanation has been helpful to you in understanding the grading of the exam.